Yeah, exactly. It's live stream. So I've never had a problem yet. I've had to brief certain people to say, listen, you need to be appropriately dressed.
I can do the top.
I think there was one moment actually where somebody's partner had come out of the shower and actually walked past the screen.
Well, that's not ideal.
It was, thankfully she was all right, and she was wearing a bathrobe, and probably quite a presentable lady actually. So it wasn't too much of a problem, even though it could have been obviously a catastrophe, not safe for work broadcast. Anyway, we are live, so welcome everybody to Brainfood Live on Air, episode 34. We are live from Melbourne. I'm absolutely delighted to be here. Melbourne's just a fantastic city, and I've had four amazing days here already. And I'm particularly pleased today because once again, my usual co-host Adam Gordon has been upgraded to Omer Molad. Omer is the CEO of a cool startup called Vervo, based out of Melbourne, and he's going to help me talk through Brainfood today. Omer, welcome to the show, man.
Hey, Han, great to be here.
That's fantastic. For the people who don't know you or your business, you want to give a quick plug on it and give it a bit of an overview?
Yeah, sure. So our mission is to make hiring about merit, not background, and we're a skills assessment platform. And what we do is we help companies see how candidates perform job-related tasks so that they can make hiring decisions, selection decisions based on what someone can do rather than other signals.
Yeah, you know what? That's so important. I was obviously been at these events in Melbourne and Sydney recently, and we're talking about how do you know what a good candidate is. And I had one lady come up to me and ask me about what I thought of psychometric kind of assessments. And whilst I, hold them in esteem, and I think they're a valuable source, valuable signal, I did need to emphasize that, hey, you want to try and get the assessment as functionally close to the job as possible, and reduce that abstraction layer. And a psychometric, in my view, is pretty abstract, and it may not be a particularly good single source of intelligence for you to make your decision. So yeah, I think if we can close the gap between assessment, the function of the job, and how we assess for it, then that's got to make sense. Anyway, Omer, great to have you on the show. I know you're a busy man, but I hope you've made time to read the Brainfood, man, because you've been on at me for not being able to send it to you, haven't you? You had some other weird kind of.
Yeah, there was like this week or two where we had this Bermuda Triangle situation where it just wasn't arriving in my inbox, but I was still on the list, but it's figured itself out now. I think I had to unsubscribe, but thankfully I'm getting it again, and I've been through the last newsletter.
Cool. On that issue, I do wonder whether other people might have had that problem, where there is a lack of delivery of the email, or the email stops being delivered for some reason, even though you haven't unsubscribed. If that's the case, please do check in your inbox to see whether it hasn't arrived. And if you want it to come back, then email me, hung@recruitingbrainfood.com, and let me know, because I don't know, it has not arrived. And it could be some sort of technical problem, or it could be an email filter somewhere, or it could be something that we could do something about. Anyway, Omer, you read issue 156, I think it was last week. What was interesting for you, man?
Yeah, the thing that stood out for me the most was the Culture Amp article. There's a lot written about diversity, but that article kind of called bullshit on some of the vanity metrics.
Right.
And I think, in the startup ecosystem, there's a lot of talk about vanity metrics in terms of measuring a company, but no one's really kind of said this out loud about diversity metrics, that there are a lot of vanity metrics that companies like to say we have X amount of people from a certain demographic, whether it's a certain type of underrepresented group, but that, it does need to go deeper than that. And this article really sort of called that out and addressed this issue of, well, diversity comes in many forms, including diversity of thought, And demographics is not just a case of you're this color or this gender. There's a lot more to it. And I really enjoyed, I think that article doesn't sort of have all the answers, but it's asking the right questions. And that got me thinking a lot.
Yeah. I think we're starting to get more sophisticated when we're thinking about D&I, aren't we? And we are challenging some of the cruder ideas of what good looks like. It isn't just a demographic distribution, that mirrors society, but it's also those, if you like, hidden factors or hidden diversities that are not obvious. As you say, the neurodiverse side is an important point. You know what? And Stephen Huang, who's the guy who wrote the post, who's I think the head of culture at Culture Amp. He actually made a very powerful third point, which I thought was controversial, but I thought needed to be made. And it was that for diversity to really have impact, it actually needs to be the practitioners of diversity need to themselves be diverse. In other words, we actually need to have more white men involved in the conversation. Because I think his third point was that a lot of white men did not feel comfortable or included in the conversation. And actually, these are the folks that typically are in powerful management positions in the companies, and they are people who could amplify the message much more than if diversity is locked into a D&I department or locked into HR or whatever. It needs to kind of escape from that function and into the wider functions of the business. And that does mean we need to have diverse people, truly diverse, meaning including all groups, into the conversation. So I thought that was a controversial point, but I'm glad he made it, and it's something.
Just on that point, I think there are two that made me think about two things. The first is a term that's used more commonly now, which is belonging, and so you want a diverse fabric, but you also want people to feel a sense of belonging, and that's everybody needs to feel that. And there's no point excluding, certain people in the company, whether they're white or men or whatever. So everyone has to feel that sense. The other thing, the point that I think you're trying to make is you need to have the majority cheerleading for diversity, not just the minority, because then you can bring about change more rapidly.
Absolutely.
And that's just critical. And so the most effective way to bring about this kind of change, and by the way, any change, is not by alienating people, but bringing people along for the journey and getting them to see why this is in everybody's interest. I think this kind of Culture Amp article can start a productive conversation on this topic.
Yeah, I'd recommend everyone read that article. I've just shared it in the chat stream there, and give Stephen Huang, I hope I pronounced his name right, a follow. He seems to be a person that's prepared to make tough comments, but coming from a position of credibility for a number of reasons, given the fact he works for a company that promotes this as a practitioner also within that company and as an ethnic minority person himself. So yeah, fantastic post. Okay, what else was interesting last week for you, Omer?
Yeah, the Jim Stroud
always
piece,
Jim Stroud,
that's always good, right? Always good value. And, I think this is a problem that's not going away. And it's on a similar theme around accessing diverse communities or people from underrepresented groups, particularly in tech. And interestingly, when I read about, particularly on Twitter, diversity in tech, there are a lot of people very vocally saying that white women is not diversity, Asian men is not diversity, and because in America, and this is particularly in the US, in Australia, for example, when they say diversity, they mainly mean gender, but in the US, they might mean people of color, right, in particular. And so there's this extra layer of complexity around what does diversity mean in each country? What does diversity mean in tech and engineering in particular? And so I think this topic of hiring female engineers, hiring engineers, people of color into engineering teams. This is not going away, and rightly so. And so, this is kind of just like, this article is like one extra sort of helpful tool, but this is just like a much bigger topic.
Yeah. You know what? You raise a very interesting point, because I do think America in general kind of commands the narrative a little bit, particularly in the topic of diversity, because American people, American companies have a huge distribution channel. Everyone watches American stuff. Everyone uses American tools, and they have a cultural dominance on this. But you're right in the sense that when people talk diversity, maybe they mean different things in the context.
Totally.
In Australia, for instance, one thing I've realized being here, which is totally unique to the continent of Australia, is this diversity often means looking into the Aboriginal community, where there's a unique set of circumstances due to the historical context here. And there's all kinds of things that, people are trying to move towards in this country. But that, of course, is absent from the diversity conversation in Germany, let's say, or a country that doesn't have that historical trajectory. So I think we do need to contextualize the conversation. What do we mean by this? And as an ethnic minority person anyway, I'm often struck by how even, the terms that we use to describe ethnicity mean different things. In the UK, for instance, an Asian person would be specifically mean to someone who's from South Asia. So the Indians, the Pakistanis, the Bangladeshis, that would be Asian, right?
And in Australia, it would typically mean Chinese or
Chinese
Vietnamese.
People.
So Southeast Asian or Chinese or East Asian. And South Asian, India, Sri Lanka, Bangladesh, Pakistan would be considered. When people say Asian, they would typically mean Southeast Asian or Chinese.
Right.
In Australia, it's a totally different concept.
It's a totally different set of people, totally different set of, we're talking about population size, billions of people were sweeping together and separating apart very casually. And you've got to think, hang on, we do need to it would be great if we could globally agree the terminology, so we could get a bit more clarity what we need. But
I mean, the way, for what it's worth, the way that I think about it is not along demographics, but along the lines of access. So which communities have a harder time getting access to education, getting access to job opportunities, within companies getting access to promotions, to learning and development, and so on. So to every kind of stage of the career funnel, let's call it, if that's a useful term. And if it's more difficult for someone to progress or achieve financial independence, for whatever reason, maybe it's because they're having children. Maybe it's because they're a partner of someone having children or a partner of someone who's unwell. Maybe it's because of their skin color, whatever. That's a problem, right? Now, every country has its own form of discrimination and marginalization, and who cares like that? So I think the answer lies not in like what, ethnicity should we focus on, but well, who's marginalized, and let's fix that. And I think we'll find that in every country, there's some form of a marginalization or some audience that is left behind or has a harder time getting either access or rights in the workplace. And let's just fix that. And if we can fix those things, I think that the sort of skin color and ethnicity and gender will largely, it'll be less significant. And it'll be more important. What's more important will be, how do we actually address, do we be more transparent around parental leave, around medical benefits in the US, which is a massive thing. Do we give people more access to education? Those are the kind of questions I think we should be asking.
Yeah. I mean, I like the refocusing of the lens there, and I can see you're a product maker, Omer, because you're looking at it from a solutions engineering point of view. How do we fix the problem rather than look at the kind of identitarian, if that's the word, type of issues. Because you're right, marginalization exists in different forms. And a different even within those groups, sometimes we're using these big categories, and in fact, there's subcategories in those groups that have very different experiences. You may say, for instance, that say Chinese people are marginalized in the UK in this context. In some contexts, yes, that's true. But I would say, there's plenty of white people that would have significantly harder time based on the fact they live in a certain part of the UK. It's got nothing to do with this.
Or they're older, or because they're old over a certain age and they find it hard. So there's ageism, and then there's disability. I mean, it's endless. Basically, anyone who's different from the majority.
Yeah, exactly. And we just got to find as product makers, as TA people, as recruiters, we've got to find a way to equalize it while still being able to recruit. I mean, let's face that head on. Recruitment itself is inherently a decision in or out for people. We're not just saying, oh, anybody can get a job. We are saying, look, we're going to assess people for it, but how do we create assessment that's fair for people, that everyone's got a fair shot at it,
right?
And we're measuring on the competence of the person or the potential of the person, rather than handicapping them or allowing inherent handicaps to have a factor in that decision. Okay, cool. What else was interesting, Omer? Give me one more, man.
I mean, they were the main two that really that I spent time on. There was another one that was a totally different topic, which was about writing.
Okay.
The sort of the trade, the craft of writing. And I just find that interesting. I don't know how it relates to, I suppose it relates to recruitment marketing, but for me, that's a skill that I've had to learn and improve on as a founder and sort of the face of our company, and learn how to improve my writing in different formats. And so I found that personally stimulating, but it's a more abstract thought piece rather than sort of here's how to recruit or something. Really
that's by a lady called Steph Smith, who used to be the head of content at TopTal, which was how I first came across her work. TopTal, obviously a very successful business matching tech contractors with opportunities. And they've got a great content arm led by Steph, or at least they did. I'm not sure how they're doing after she left. I know they've had some changes there, but she's been featured in Brainfood a couple of times. She does produce great content. But I particularly like this post because she was exposing her methodology in the production of the content. And I just thought, right, for people who are struggling to produce a blog, or they wonder why certain bits of content seems to be very virally shared, and heavily read and well respected and have long tail kind of value, Steph wrote basically her method. Which I thought that was very useful for her to open that up and share it. So I've just shared that blog on the chat stream there, so check that out, and give Steph a follow. Okay, cool. Let's move on to
and I think if I can just make one more comment on that. I think it's such an underrated skill, writing, and when people approach me cold, it can be someone who maybe wants to work at our company. I can be immediately impressed if someone is articulate in how they write. And you can imagine the amount of noise, the amount of emails, LinkedIn requests that I get all day long. But, you can if you want to stand out, write well. And I think that applies to every form of communication and marketing. And so few people write well, and it's such an underrated skill. So to me, that's interesting.
Yeah, I think that's a very important point. And actually, the Brainfood community is interested in this. And I know that because basically the content that I've featured that does talk about content production is usually very heavily read. I remember a post a couple of weeks ago talking about how the military write emails. Did you remember that one? Bottom line up front is their metaphor, bluff. So in other words, you're writing email in military context, you have to just get your point across. You need to get your demand up front in block capitals, what you want the other person to do, what do you want the receiver to do. So bottom line up front in all of your email. And then you can start putting context in there and the reasons why and stuff like that. But make the damn thing easier to read. I've just shared the Brainfood Larder there. The Larder, by the way, is basically a database we've built to make Brainfood searchable. So all of the articles that are featured in every newsletter is searchable in the Brainfood Larder. Please do bookmark that. And you can search for Bluff and all of the other content writing pieces in there if that floats your boat. Okay, cool. Let's talk about Melbourne, man. So for the people,
best place to live in the world.
You know what? Having been here for 3-4 days, apart from yesterday, it was raining, terrible. I do think it's got a hell of a lot of charm to it. So part of the journey I've been in Perth, I've been in Sydney, I've been in Melbourne. And I think that whilst there's universal challenges in recruitment, I also think there's local conditions and local flavors on a city by city level, which sometimes can impact how recruitment operates here. So I just want to throw it out to you, Omer, before we start bringing in some of our other guests who've going to join us later to talk about the situation in Melbourne. How is it different from Sydney? Is it different from Sydney? And how does it sit really with the rest of Australia and Asia Pac?
Look, I think there are people who will have more expertise than me in terms of recruitment specifically. But what I can say is this. So we sell into the US market and in Australia. And the key difference is 80 or 90% of Australia is essentially Melbourne and Sydney. They're the two biggest cities. And I apologize in advance to all the people that I've just offended that are outside Melbourne and Sydney. And so really, you can go and visit everyone in person. And I'm now talking about sort of customers, but if you think about recruitment, it's the same thing, right? And there's intimacy, and particularly in Melbourne, more so than Sydney. Melbourne's even more intimate, but there are 5 million people that live here. So it's this huge city, but the central business district can be walked in 15 minutes. So you can go see any customer, you can meet any candidate for a coffee. And that's a very powerful thing. And I've been thinking about this a lot as we sort of acquire customers, raise capital, make key hires as a company. If you want something big done, be in the room, do it in person. It's just very powerful. You don't need to do something that scales. And I think anyone who's not using that in Melbourne or Melbourne and Sydney is hurting themselves, because that's just like a huge superpower that we have here.
You know what? That's a very important point, which I didn't really clock until you articulated in that way. But a couple of my friends that have been here have mentioned this. And they said, look, it's all about relationships in Australia. And I just think, well, it seems like a cliche to me. What does that mean? But now you've just said that essentially, because it's possible to do in person in even a big city like Melbourne, to not do it might actually signal something quite negative.
Right.
Whereas I'm in London, I don't meet anybody. So it's like, listen, right, I can't get across the tube. Let's hop on a VC. Let's do it.
And in Los Angeles, imagine in LA trying to meet, forget across the US, which you've got no hope, but even in LA, just the traffic, you just wouldn't do it. You wouldn't meet anybody because your whole
get on a call, you video them or something like that.
And here it's like, oh yeah, I'll just come see you. Let's have a coffee. That's exactly what happens. And if you think about recruitment, and there's all this noise around human, making recruitment human again, and technologies come in and automate. I mean, here you can go and meet anybody within 10 minutes in a city of 5 million people. That's unique.
Yeah.
And it's as simple as that.
Yeah. So it's basically, not only do you have to sweat the small stuff, but actually the small stuff is significant, because if you don't do it, if you're just a telephone guy, or if you're just an email person or whatever, you're probably not achieving the sort of intimacy that is expected. And I think it's all about meeting the expectation. Like you mentioned, in a very widely distributed, geographically distributed city like LA, probably everyone understands that meeting in person, you reserve that for a really critical thing or a really important type of, you don't do that on first touch point because it's too hard for both parties to do. Whereas if it's easy for both parties to do and you don't do it, then actually that may signal a few negative things. So super interesting insight. Okay, cool. Tell me about the, let me just bring in some of these guys here, because we've got lots of people that, as you mentioned.
Let's bring some people in.
Yeah, I think we've got a few people that have volunteered their time. So thank you very much, everyone, for doing that. Our first person I'm going to bring on, actually, it's going to be Lauren Sharp. Lauren, I hope you can see me there. I actually just saw Lauren for breakfast about 2 hours ago. She looked significantly better than I did and do, I have to say. And that's down to her healthy living, which she's been telling me about. But I'm going to invite Lauren into the show now and see if we can get her insight as to what recruitment is all about in Melbourne. Do you know Lauren, Omer? Have you met her?
We've never met, but I'm excited to meet her now.
Yeah, I mean, she and her man Craig Watson have started a superb podcast called Tapod, which is, I think, one of the first Aussie sort of ran and Aussie-centric podcasts that are out there. But it's really fantastically produced. And it's something I'd recommend people subscribe to there. And there she is. How are you doing, Lauren?
I'm good. Just let me know if my sound's not right, because I forgot to bring my microphone.
Good Lord, Lauren. I thought you were a professional podcaster these days.
Well, we had an emergency podcast with Derek Redmond, so it was essential.
Essential. For people who don't know, by the way, Derek Redmond has been with us in Melbourne for the last couple of days. He gave the opening keynote at RecFest, which we were all involved in yesterday. And yeah, he's hanging around town, so yeah, you got to go grab him whilst he's there.
He's actually off to Sydney this afternoon for the next week or so, and I believe he's going to watch England lose live to Australia Saturday night.
Do you think that's going to happen? I mean,
I'm praying to the rugby gods.
You got to hope. You got to hope for the best, don't you? Okay, exactly. Lauren. For people who don't know you, can you just quickly introduce yourself and what do you do?
Oh, so hold on, sorry. Basically, I've been in recruitment for around about 15 years now. Did agency, then I've been over 10 years now doing in-house TA functions. I work for IMA Management and Technology. I've got a bit of a side hustle with my own agency. And we started Tapod 8 weeks ago now, and it has gone a little bit on the old crazy side.
I know. I mean, you've done it for 8 weeks. I've done bloody Brainfood for like 35 weeks, probably more because I've missed a few weeks. And you're like so far ahead of me. It's ridiculous.
Well, I don't know how the hell it happened, because honestly, we don't know what the hell we're doing.
Maybe that's
usually the recipe for success, though.
And it's working. It's working. I've got to say, it's working.
Yeah. Actually, Lauren, let's
Chad and Steve don't know what they're doing, and they've been managed to turn that into a trademark.
Yeah, I've actually met with Joel and Chad earlier this year, and I can confirm they don't know what they're doing.
Exactly. Yeah. All they do, their whole strategy is to get people to buy them beer.
Yeah,
and that's it. That's the strategy.
They've got no clue. Actually, Lauren, whilst we're talking about podcasting, I just wanted to touch base with you on this, because you're a practitioner. You're still running a business. So is your partner Craig as well. Business partner Craig, should I say? Just to be clear on that point. What is the value of doing this podcast? Because a lot of people, I'm sure, would be saying, how do you find the time? What do you get out of it? All this type of stuff. Can you what's your view there?
A few different things, actually. Well, we started it because there was no Australian content, and we had the idea probably 8 or 9 months ago now to try and do something, but I didn't know where to start. So I discussed it with Craig, and we decided to do it together. And just everyone's listening to you. They're listening to English and European content, a little bit of stuff from the States, but it really doesn't have a huge relevance to our market down here. It's very different over there, recruitment-wise and TA-wise. It's extremely competitive and very salesy. We're more relationship-driven, I feel, in Australia. But I do agree with you. They're different in every state and every city about how we approach these things. I recently moved from Sydney nearly 2 years ago now. I was there for nearly 20 years. So recruiting in that market and then coming to Melbourne has been quite a change, and a more positive change, to be honest. Sorry, Sydney, but I think Melbourne do it better.
Why? What's the difference between Melbourne and Sydney when it comes to recruitment behaviour?
Melbourne is a lot more relationship driven. As Omer, you said before, we can get across the town quite quickly and go and have that coffee, meet somebody, discuss candidates, discuss with potential clients if you're agency. It's easier to relate, and you hash it out over a coffee, over a beer on a Friday afternoon. It's one of those things that people, they talk to each other more so, where in Sydney it's a pick up the phone. No one really leaves their office that often. It's an email driven and phone driven process.
I'm gonna throw something at both of you. I reckon it's all about the tram system you have here. You have an incredible public transport system. I took it in today. I don't think I even paid any money. You got a free transit system in the central area of it. And folks, let me tell you, the Melbourne tram system is absolutely incredible. It's got 280 odd stops. It's the biggest tram system in the world. And more or less you can get point to point very quickly, very efficiently. And I just wonder whether the provision of this way of moving people around actually means that an in-person meeting is pretty convenient. And it just unlocks that culture of intimacy, which wouldn't be available if it wasn't there.
Yeah, I would agree. Yeah.
This is obviously a bigger discussion, but I think, I agree with what Lauren was saying, that there's a friendliness here. There's a European sort of feeling. It's almost like in Melbourne, it's not okay to be too cool. People kind of really don't like that. They don't like people who are sort of too big for their boots or too sort of celebrity. And it's just, in Melbourne, you're expected to be low key, to be laid back and to just be accessible. And it doesn't matter how important you are or how rich you are or whatever, whether you play sport, it's just, you say hi to everyone, you're nice, you meet in person. That's just what it's like here. It's almost like a small town feel, probably not quite.
You see someone standing on a corner trying to work out on their phone how to find somewhere. You need a hand. Do you want me to help you point you in the right direction? And someone goes, oh, yeah, thanks. And that happened to me when I first moved here so many times. And now I just stop and do it for people. It's you would never get that in other places.
It's a friendly place. And
right. We have to stop this from becoming like a tourist kind of endorsement for Melbourne.
For the Melbourne Tourism Bureau.
Yeah. We're getting kind of some great promo from. Tell me one thing that you don't like about recruitment in Melbourne.
Honestly, I've loved my move here ever since I have. I'm loving my job. I love the fact that I've started a podcast. I love everything here.
I'll give you something that's challenging here. That technical talent is not rich enough. So we're behind, and also we don't have enough of a culture of risk taking and innovation as a society, and that hurts us. People here go to university and they go into professional services. They go to work at law firms, accounting, consulting firms, rather than start their own business. And that's probably an Australian thing more broadly. And then it's hard to start businesses, raise capital, hire engineers, hire designers, and so on. It's getting better, but there's a lot of noise about it, but we're a long way away compared to, the Bay Area, New York, London, sort of key hubs of innovation.
Since moving and looking at the different dynamics of tech and the shortages in the different places in Sydney and Melbourne has definitely got a real buzz around digital, and there's a lot more independent, smaller digital houses and startups coming up than there are in Sydney, I've got to say, and I really noticed that difference. There's a lot more skill sets in your big beasts of technology such as SAP and Oracle in Sydney, where I think down here you've got a lot more people taking that little bit more risk along the digital startup line.
Is it easy to set up a business in Australia?
Yeah, it's not hard.
Is it 24-hour turnaround type of thing, or what do you need to do?
Less than that. I managed to register the podcast in an afternoon.
Right. Yeah. So
it's not the bureaucracy.
Yeah.
It's not the bureaucracy. It's just
lack of talent.
And risk taking. So it's too easy for people to get safe jobs. And we have a pretty good welfare system. In America, employment is at will. You don't get benefit. There are so many things that are just more difficult. And here we get looked after really well. And so People choose safer options. And I think that's, if you want to have a culture of creation and innovation and entrepreneurship, then that's a discussion.
This is a tough one to talk about though, Omer, because you're kind of saying, look, the bad things about America, and apologies to all my American friends out there, but I think basically the lack of benefits, the lack of holiday, the kind of a real difference in power between employer and employee, I think they're probably negative things in the States. They could definitely improve that. But what you're also saying is that by that, the situation also then creates more risk-taking on behalf of those employees that might just jettison out and question why they should get another job, because they might as well set their own stuff up, and therefore, new company creation.
That's right. It's a trade-off. I see, and I can even sort of double down on that, because I grew up in Tel Aviv, which is, Israel is a place that is complex and difficult and challenging, but wonderfully creative and entrepreneurial and so talented. And part of that's the military and the education system. A lot of things contribute to that. And none of those things are present here in Australia, but the lifestyle is amazing. And I've made a personal choice that, okay, it's a trade-off. So you give up some of those things, but you have this amazing life that we have here. And then within that, I've tried to forge the career and that I've chosen and build a company. But, that is a trade-off as a society, that they don't necessarily, the sort of very, very high standard of living is not conducive to peak innovation. And they don't always go together. Now, is there a balance? Absolutely. But if you want to optimize for innovation, you're probably not going to optimize for standard of living or welfare or some of these other things. True.
Yeah, I think that's a very valid point. I'd love to. I'm starting to cycle through my mind now to think of examples where you have very strong welfare state provision and social security and stuff like that. And how does that compare?
Scandinavia.
Right. My first thought was this, and how does that compare to entrepreneurial culture there? And then I'm cycling through examples in Asia, let's say, what is considered to be super entrepreneurial Hong Kong, let's say, social security there. What does that look like? So maybe there is that sort of tough trade-off that we need to chew over and think about what kind of society we really want. Okay, cool. Listen, we've got some other guests to bring on. So I'm going to keep on the line there, Lauren. I'm going to see if I can bring on, let's see who is there. Oh, Ross Clennett is there. Let's see whether we can bring Ross on and get his opinion. Ross has been a great supporter of the Brainfood, and he's a very avid commentator online. So, I'll be interested to see what his perspective is on recruiting in Melbourne and Australia, really. Let's see if we can get him online. Have you guys met Ross, by the way? Is he someone you know? Oh, there he is. Good afternoon, Ross. How are you?
Hi, very well. How are you today?
Yes.
Hi, Omer.
Very well. Great to have you on the show, Ross. Thank you, firstly, for being such an awesome promoter of recruiting Brainfood, by the way. I always see you comment on it and share the articles and stuff like that. So great that it's kind of resonating with what you do. But for the people who don't know you, actually, Ross, can you just introduce yourself quickly and what is it that you do for the recruiting community?
Yeah, sure. So 14 years in agency recruitment, originally with Hayes in London, although I'm originally from Hobart. And then I had 10 years with what became known as Recruitment Solutions, so working for Greg Savage for a lot of that time. And then I've had 16 years running my own business, so it's a recruitment training and coaching business. So I run 3 programs via webinars, and I coach owners, and I have a group owners program, and my passion is blogging. So I've been producing a weekly blog since September 2007.
That's amazing. We're talking about writing earlier today with Omer, actually, about how you can get better at writing and why that's important. As someone who is a proficient and an efficient blogger, can you tell people what value you get out of doing that?
Well, for me, it's the continual practice of the articulation of what I call my specialized knowledge. And it's a great way to apply discipline to thinking through what I read and hear. And it's, I mean, as much as I hope what I produce is useful for the audience, it's actually mainly useful for me, because if I read a research paper or if I go to an event and I hear a speaker, then I want to make the most of what I've taken from that paper or that speaker. So if I then look at my notes or look at the paper and I think about, okay, what's an angle that my audience would be interested in? And then I go about writing the material with that angle in mind, it just reinforces the value that I took from that article or paper or speaker, and it also adds something to my own intellectual capital.
Yeah, you know what? You've touched on a few things that I've kind of come across on neuropsychology, or neuroscience, should I say, about how the practice of writing can help kind of activate different parts of your brain, and it basically deepens the learning of the concept. So if you, for instance, listen to a lecture, how you actually write notes has an impact, and how you recall the information and how it then synthesizes with other things that you've heard and read. And of course, how we're kind of moving to a culture where things are getting more and more ephemeral in terms of our information consumption. We're probably spending less time really processing and deeply thinking about topics because we don't have the time. And maybe the blogging thing is kind of a loss, an art that's kind of going downhill a little bit, because people don't seem to have the time to do it. They're tweeting, they're posting. I'm an example, actually. I used to write blogs myself until I found I couldn't create at the rate that I wanted to, which is why I started to curate, because I found that a little bit easier for me. So it's great that you've consistently been blogging for 12 years now, which is a fantastic commitment. Great stuff. Okay, Ross, we're talking here about recruitment in Melbourne, and Melbourne in particular, and Australia in general. And we're just trying to figure out, what are the local nuances and challenges that occur specifically in this area of Australia. Do you have any opinions on that, or do you think actually no, it's generally Australian issues or generally global issues?
Well, a couple of things to add to what has already been said, and although Omer was partly right, I'll just make a kind of what I would say a fuller disclosure. If you're a man, you can walk from one end of Melbourne CBD to the other in 15 minutes. But if you're a woman in high heels, you can't do it in 15 minutes. Yeah. So I think we need to just note that.
That's why the tram system's free.
Yes, exactly. But certainly about the concept of seeing people face to face. And in fact, a classic example is a client of mine based in Brisbane. He recruits project managers for mine sites. And I just noticed on LinkedIn this morning, there was a photo of himself and one of his employees at Jabiru, one of the mine sites quite away from Brisbane. So he's flown there with his employee to go onto site to actually meet his contractors and to actually meet his clients. And this is not uncommon. He does that regularly. And I'd imagine for recruiters in the UK, the thought of getting on a plane, a light plane for hour and a half, 2 hours to take 3 days out of your week to go and do that, I suspect would seem slightly crazy. But in Australia, if you're serious about doing business long term, that's the sort of thing that you will do.
Yeah, and in the UK, I mean, you worked there in London for a period, Ross, you'd know this, but definitely it's just a hyper-optimized environment, especially for your agency. I remember back in the days that actually people had problems with me taking time to meet my candidates, meet my client managers. I would take all the time I required to really deepen the relationship. Because in my view, the longer the meeting, the more opportunity it was to learn more about this person and get a better, and to get more intimate with them. So there was never such a thing as an efficient meeting time. But I remember some of my managers saying, "Oh, you're taking too long meeting your client. That needs to be a 35-minute meeting." And I'm thinking, what?
I got that as well when I would recruit in Sydney when I was back in my agency days. Like, to go out and see a client, if you weren't going to spend $100 on it one way on a taxi fare, you'd have to get the train. And then you'd have to try and work out to get from the train stop to your client. And I remember one day coming back from agency, and it was probably a 4-hour round trip for a half-hour meeting. And, my manager fried me.
Well, in London, when I started back in 1989, a long time ago, it was seen as a weakness if you had to go out and see a client, because you were meant to be able to do everything over the phone. And so to leave the office to meet a client was almost an act of shame.
Yeah, it's failure to be a successful telephone salesman.
That's right.
And you weren't a good enough closer. And that's probably the culture of recruitment, certainly in London and the UK, is that it was a hard sell telephone-based job. And it's probably kind of moving in a fairly painful transition away from the phone, because, of course, people have stopped taking calls generally. I think, was it last year, maybe 2018 was the first year where the number of phone calls actually went down for the first time.
But I also think that that's in relation to with the rise and the more development within the TA teams in companies as well. They're not having to look outside as much to agencies, do you think?
Yeah, in my view, yeah, we've seen an emergence of the in-house community. There's no doubt about that. And I think we've seen in 20 years ago, 15 years ago, whatnot, the only people working in-house were working in these big RPO type businesses, or they were, somehow emerged from a HR function. But they certainly weren't the sorts of people we're seeing in the profession now. We've got highly educated, highly professional, some of the best people, I think, are working in these in-house functions, particularly for rapid growth businesses or for businesses going through transformation and change. These are big jobs. So yeah, I think in-house definitely is a massive competitor for agency, and it's definitely eaten into market share. There's no question about that in my view. Okay, cool. Let's talk about Australia generally, folks. A conservative culture, true or not?
Depends what part of Australia.
Yeah.
True.
You're going to go with true, Omer, right?
Yeah, because I'm not necessarily thinking about just politically. I just think about conservative in terms of taking risk. Absolutely true. And touching on what we talked about before, compared to, say, the Bay Area or Tel Aviv, people taking risk with capital or with their careers, unquestionably, we're conservative. If you're referring to politically, that's a different story. Then it really depends where.
Can you explain why? I mean, I've heard this number of times that people have shared it publicly, self-reflection, Aussies basically commentating on their own culture, saying, yeah, we're pretty conservative. Like, why is that the case? Do you have a theory?
I think it's some of the things we touched on earlier around the quality of life is very high. There is access to opportunity. So there's a lot to lose. We have a professional services economy. We have a lot of education. So people basically are encouraged to go and do law or medicine at university, as opposed to creating, as opposed to starting businesses. And so they study and then they go into professional services. And we reward that. And we like we touched on before, there's welfare, there are a lot of protections. And so you can actually do very well financially without taking a lot of risk and live a pretty good life. And there's a strong middle class. Whereas in America and a lot of other countries, basically you get nothing. No security, no welfare, and you just have to make it for yourself. And so people make different choices and it breeds innovation. I'm not saying it's good or bad, it's just different. And for me, growing up in Tel Aviv, where, Israel is inherently a culture of risk, and for a whole host of reasons, and most of them aren't good, by the way, but that's all I knew. And then I came here and I felt like no one wants to take any risk at all. And so it's a massive contrast in culture.
You know what? I think there may well be a direct relationship between security and risk. If you have no security, then of course you're going to be a bigger risk taker. I mean, that just makes sense, right? If you literally have no security blanket, then your options are you're going to go for it. There's nothing to lose to a certain degree, which is kind of like a somewhat depressing kind of way to look at it, but it may simply be a question of trade-offs, as you mentioned earlier.
Being backed into a corner without choices.
Exactly. You know what? I'm going to bring on a final guest of ours because he's been waiting very patiently. Adam Walker. He's a chap that kind of works. You know Adam, do you, Lauren? It seems.
I do know Adam.
Yeah.
Yes, I know Adam.
Oh, goodness. Everyone knows Adam, but probably not in a good way.
Oh, he's wonderful.
He's wonderul. Let me see if I can bring him
guy.
on. Because I met with Adam. We had lunch together, and he had some things, very interesting things to say, particularly about because he's working for a big consultancy and providing those types of services. How does that sort of dudes, we have a problem. I failed to recall that we can only have 4 people on screen at any one time. So in order to bring Adam on, we're going to have to lose somebody. Oh no. Listen, Omer, I'm going to have to say, would you mind stepping down for this?
No problem. I've been from the start. So
yeah. So I beg your pardon, Omer. I was hoping to keep you all the way through, but let me invite Adam on, and I'll see you a bit later because I'm actually in the opposite room to Omer right now. So I'll catch up with him after the show's finished. Omer, great to have you.
Close the video.
Yeah, good to have you on the show, mate.
Bye, Omer.
That's a bit embarrassing, isn't it? But let me see. It's like kicking a friend off the dinner table. Make rooms for somebody else. There we go. But we'll see if Adam can come and join us and add a bit of flavor from the enterprise side of it. I think he's also got some international experience. It seems that a lot of the recruiters, people in TA in Australia, have got international experience. And there's a lot of Brits here, actually, I've noticed, be quite dominant in the market here. Again, don't know why.
I actually have not actually worked overseas in the TA function at all, and but I worked for a multinational and recruited a lot of overseas people to come to Australia. So building whole entire teams out for SAP implementations and bringing them on shore. And that's a whole move on a 4-year visa for families to pick up and move. So that's sort of where my international experience comes through.
It's fascinating kind of a country to recruit for, I think, in this country. But anyway, Adam is here. Adam Walker, how are you doing, sir? Sorry to keep you waiting for all this time.
Right, mate. How are you?
I'm all right. I think apparently Lauren and Ross know you. So
I know poor Omer as well. It's a very poor substitute to have me for him. So apologies to the audience.
Yeah, we've degraded the show now by getting Adam Walker onto it. I do apologize for the viewers. But no, Adam, for the people who don't know you, can you just introduce yourself and what it is that you do?
I work with a Big Four consultancy leading our talent acquisition advisory practice across ANZ. Get involved a little bit up in Asia as well these days. And a big part of that is working with organisations about how they recruit full stop. So the filter I'd like to try and take with organisations is always how does your business build its workforce of tomorrow?
Okay, I think we're getting a bit of a lag from you there,
includes your HR. Sorry, mate.
I don't know whether anybody else got that, but I think there was a bit of a lag. Do you mind repeating the last thing that you said, Adam?
Sorry, Hong. The filter I normally take with organisations, or we try to take from an approach perspective, is how do they build their future workforce? So it's not just about pointing at the HR or TA team. It's actually looking at systems, policies, processes, technologies, culture, so hiring culture, attitude within the business, and how they go about it full stop.
This kind of, if you're operating basically at this corporate level, talking to big companies that have thousands of people on staff, what is the challenges for these businesses currently that are based out of Australia?
Yeah, I think some of them are very similar to what organisations face globally. So because the work's changing so quickly based on things like market demand and consumer bases moving quickly, and the fluidity of work is so much quicker. So that's not obviously that's not just similar in Australia. It's pretty much a global force these days. And big organisations struggle. They struggle to keep up. I guess we've got to remember they've been based on this hierarchical command and control militaristic models that may have worked 20 years gone by, but it's pretty hard to be agile when you're 50 plus thousand people or even 5,000 people. So there's that, and there's also from the market competition is one side, but from the individual side, people don't want to do work in the same way that they wanted to do work 20 years gone by. So there's the individual pressure where if I'm a good Python coder and I want to go and do an interesting, meaningful piece of work, I'll do it from my home, in my pajamas, on the bench. Thanks very much.
Personally, I'd go to Bali.
Yeah, well, but organisations struggle with engaging with different types of engagements because even our technology platforms, like the big tier, you got to remember they're based FTE constructs. So we're working out how do we engage with good people to do cool stuff together, not even work. It's a different mind shift that organisations are really struggling with.
How do you find, though, Adam, if you're like in that big level and you've got a lot of people coming through the doors, you've got a lot of different practitioners in different areas of technology, finance, whatever, how do you retain those people? How do you build those big teams, knowing we've got talent shortage markets in Australia, and retain that interest when everyone else is moving so much quicker than you guys when it comes to approvals, agile, all of the other buzz things that are going on?
Yeah, I think obviously it's never one size fits all, and that's both from if you're an organisation of 5,000 people in FMCG, your branding and your EVP and the like is very different to a 50,000 person bank, for example. But then within each of those organisations as well, what's going to really motivate your top tier finance executive is very different to both businesses, but also very different to then the contact centre environment or the technology, the IT environment. And again, to be honest, a lot of organisations that we go and help or try to help, they're often facing the same problems. Recruitment is seen as a chore. It sits in a shared services centre. It's not seen as strategic. All the same problems that I'm sure we know happens globally as well. But Australia's not immune. I mean, we often see really good people struggling to achieve the results across very diverse need because they keep getting the headcount cost cut or they keep getting the budget cut. And yet a lot of boards in our region, I think, are still slowly coming around to the idea of sort of chief talent officer type thinking or that organisational competitive advantage and seeing strategic TA as a lever, competitive lever, not as a process chore that's a cost centre.
What are the characteristics of a company that have kind of transitioned to that mentality compared to the ones that resist it? I mean, do you have I'll put this to you first, Adam, but I'd really love to hear Ross and Lauren on this as well. Are there certain characteristics that you can identify that would kind of signal the readiness of a company to make that move?
Yeah, I mean, from the outset, if you're looking from the external in, if they're engaging with some of the cool tools, and thousands of them as you weekly present to us, but if they're actually trying to reach people in a manner that's personalised and meaningful to them, the word can be overused, but if it is authentic and they've actually thought about what it means to come work with us, come and do meaningful things together, and then I often sort of say, if you're talking to a good TA head and they're thinking of changing jobs, I've always recommended make sure you make yourself harder to get. So ask to speak to the level above the people that we're going to interview you. And what I mean by that is if you're being interviewed by the chief HR officer, ask to meet with the CEO as well. And if they don't get it, they won't do it. And that's pretty indicative that that's all they really think of recruitment, right? Whereas if they say, what, good idea, this person's really going to want to have an impact, you've probably got a little more chance if the organisation really wants to invest the time and effort in you as a TA head.
Yeah.
You know what? That's a really useful trick. It's been a long time since I've been a candidate, but if I ever need to sort of go back to the world of work,
I'm going to get him as my interview coach.
Yeah, I was going to say, it never occurred to me. Of course, I'm going to go and see, can I see the person above? And if they say no, good litmus test.
So
well, the other good thing about the acid test there is that often when you do get in, they sort of say, "I was like, you're the guy that wanted to meet with X, Y, Z, and you've already got a bit of a runway for. Okay, well, and now are you worth all this effort? Let's see what happens."
Oh gosh, create the yoke before you get in the door.
On that note, that just follow up on the point there, Ross, I want to come to you. Do you see any characteristics of businesses that are more ready to make to prioritize talent, not just talk about it at a rhetorical level, but make some structural changes to become better recruiting organizations? I mean, is there a theme? Is it organizational size, maturity, industry sector?
Well, there's probably two or three things, and to the point that's already been mentioned, there's a famous story about Bill Gates from many years ago that he would, and I assume this to be true, that he told the Microsoft graduate recruiting team that if they thought a phone call from him to a target graduate would actually make the difference in landing that graduate, and the recruiting team believed that graduate was high enough quality that was really important, then he said, contact me and I will make the call to that person. And I think that's a fantastic example to the points raised earlier about when the CEO does something like that, injects themselves or makes themselves available to the recruiting team, that really says something about how important they regard top talent. And I think in this country, my view is we're very slow at differentiating between, the average good employee and then the person who will make a difference to the organisation, and then taking a different approach to recruitment. So that's the first thing to say. The second really is, does the organisation measure engagement? Are they committed to improve it? Do they then have the recruitment marketing then in conjunction with the marketing of the company work on a coordinated brand and have some distinctions for the employer brand? I think those are the sorts of things that signal that a company and the leadership of that company is really serious about talent, rather than just it's something that we need to do along with many other things that we need to do.
I work for a small professional services firm, so we find it a lot easier to get to the C-suite and be part of that table, as everyone wants to be invited to. So I'm very lucky that I can just walk up to my CEO, Urchner, and just say, I need this now. And she'll go, right, why? Explain it to me. And she'll sit there, she'll hash it out. She'll be the devil on your shoulder if it needs to be. And it's easier for me to do that in a smaller company. I'm very lucky with that. And she listens to me, which I have a seat at that table where I know it's a bit of a hard one for some people to get that. And she listens to engagement. I've got the metrics. I've got everything I need to recruit and do those hot lists, where I'm lucky. I'm one of the lucky ones.
So maybe company size, I mean, obviously company size has something to do with it. Possibly part of the reason why the startups can sometimes outcompete the big corporates for technical talent, because they do operate more quickly. There's less of less links in the chain to the top. They're more prepared to get involved at the C-level to get the recruitment done. So I can see maybe there's an inherent advantage for a 50, 150, 250 size company compared to your tens of thousands, especially if there's, the ways in which that company makes decisions isn't clear. I mean, I think, Adam, I remember our lunch a couple of days ago, you mentioned that actually working for a consultancy has its own unique some challenges, specifically because it is a partnered the organizational structure is a partnership. Therefore, there's lots of people that actually have executive decision-making power.
Yeah, it is. It's my sort of the last couple of years is my first exposure to a member firm type setup where literally there's 800 plus owners of the business in Australia alone. And that's got its pros and cons, but of course there's overlap in lots of things that happen, and that happens in big corporates as well. What's the saying about success has 1,000 fathers and failure's a lonely orphan, and that happens. I've seen it in big corporates directly where something goes well and everybody wants to own it and take their slice of it and put their name up in lights. Something goes wrong and everyone will step back, and if you're caught there sort of not off guard, then you'll find yourself in trouble. But I mean, some of the difficult things then about, I think a lot of big corporates face is they might have the passion And I think you're right. I think there's definitely a correlation in the bigger you get, the harder it gets to be personalised and to take that journey and to have the CEO call every new hire. But it doesn't necessarily need to be just the CEO if you think about it and you structure your organisation where it can still be really meaningful to come in as a business analyst into a big bank tomorrow and have the head of division, and it still matters to them. So I think often it's certainly more difficult, but it's about attitude. It's about the corporate attitude from the big companies to the small companies. How much do they see their people as value, and then as part of that, how much do they want to engage them?
Yeah.
What do you see as the? We're running a little bit over time at this point, so we'll have to ask a few last kind of questions to you guys with regards to the local conditions in Australia. Where do you see the direction of travel for TA in this country? Is it running roughly along the same lines as you see it on a global level? Where do you see divergence from global trends, for instance? That kind of phenomena. Ross, I go to you first if I can.
I'm probably not the best person to answer that question, given my world's mainly agency recruitment. But a couple of things to say is that there aren't that many large organisations in Australia compared to the United States. And as a result of that, there's, I think, still a fairly strong dependence on recruitment agencies. So the recruitment agency sector in this country is still doing well, still growing strongly, still, I think, delivering a lot of value. So I think that's probably something to say. I think the technology side is probably, again, an area where we tend to lag behind, going back to what Omer said in terms of the conservative side, waiting to see which is the right technology, who's getting it right. And so that's an area I think we probably are lagging behind. But again, if you're comparing yourself to the United States, I suspect there's substantial regional differences there as well. So that's probably about as much as I've got to contribute on that topic, I suspect.
No, but you make a very good point. I mean, particularly when it comes to recruitment technology, it could be that the most sensible commercial posture to take for an Australian founder would be to look at what's happening in the US and see whether you could replicate a localized version of it, specifically for the Australian market. Because I do think US companies struggle to get to Australia for geographical and time zone reasons more than anything. So practical challenges there. And we talked previously again about the requirement for intimacy for business relations here. And that typically means boots on the ground. You need to have a team here. You need to do all of those things. So suddenly the barriers to entry become even greater. So maybe you're right. Maybe if we accept the narrative that Aussie tech is generally on the conservative side, maybe that's actually a sensible posture to take, because
sorry, going back to that, is it's not just the time zones and the location, it's also our economy and the size of our population too. Is it worth them investing that amount of money to put a team on the ground for a population that's the size of New York?
Yeah. So
it's a lot of money for a very big country with not many people in it and not that big of an economy.
Great point. And it may be a 50-year plan to do it, right? I mean, Australia probably has space to ultimately become a mega-sized country, I guess, at some point. But it's not.
The United Kingdom fits in Australia 13 times landmass.
Right, crazy stuff.
And I think famously, it's 92% of our population is currently in 1.2% of the landmass, because a very large majority of our country is uninhabitable because it's desert.
Yeah. Rainfall, nothing grows.
But I think also, isn't there a case that, I mean, going into the history of Australia, a lot of it is down to where people landed first. When the first settlements occurred, that was ultimately, if it was successful, it just simply grew.
The first to land here in the 1400s over in Western Australia, and they landed and just went, "This is shit," and kept on going.
Dear, oh dear. Yeah, we'll have to get some of those boys onto the show at some point. All right, moving on to the final couple of points. On the question that we asked, I was going to go to Adam on that, but he's obviously going crazy online there. This is kind of disturbing.
Oh dear.
This happened last time with when we were in Sydney. I think there must be something going on here. Okay, direction of travel, divergence and convergence with regards to global trends. Where do you see that happening, Adam, if at all?
Yeah, I think we've probably touched on a lot of the drivers for that localization here. The cultural element, where we're a small economy, we're a small population. That risk aversion definitely exists, not from just from the startup side, but by the buyer side for acquiring new tools and technologies. Compared to the US market in particular, and certainly a lot of Europe, here everybody wants to see who else adopts it first and how it goes, and then we'll maybe be second or third adopted, but we won't take the risk just in case. Yeah. Whereas, my experience in some of the US market was everybody wants to get a competitive differentiator against their competitors, and if they can see something they think is cool, they'll pick it up and pilot it or run a proof of concept at least. So that's probably different. Some of the macro drivers behind what good TA or good engagement, they're sort of global things around the need to be much more personalised. We discussed the other day, hung around, if you want to look at where HR and TA is going, look at marketing 20 years gone by. And they are some of the drivers that are forcing things like the use of data, the personalisation, the predictive analytics. We've been doing that for 20 odd years in marketing. It's finally coming into HR circles. Some of those macro trends, focusing on internal talent. Organisations are trying to deconstruct rapidly, and they keep on missing who they've already got. They're sort of pretty consistent, but I think the cultural elements that we've touched on a lot today, and not just Melbourne, but in a lot of Australia, and you don't underestimate also isolation. So I think Lauren touched on it before. It's pretty easy for us to become insular in the way we think, because a lot of big businesses here aren't necessarily even APAC connected. A lot of big businesses here, I think we've got one of the top 500 businesses globally or something similar. So we're not actually big businesses really. So it's pretty easy to stare at your navel a bit more around here than it is if you are smack bang in Hong Kong, or if you're smack bang in London, or North American markets. So some of those sort of things definitely also change that sort of social engagement on how we look to work with people. Fascinating,
Adam. Okay. Lauren, I'm going to give you the final word. Australia, TA and recruitment, convergence or divergence with regards to the rest of the world. Where do you see it happen? Where do you see it going?
Oh, bloody hell, put the pressure on. I think we're always going to be that little bit behind because of what Adam just said. Everyone just really doesn't want to take any risk. It's going to be financial. If they do, it's not going to happen at all. Oh, bloody hell, my computer's going crazy, guys. I'm sorry. There we go.
You know what? Yeah, this is a thing in Australia I've noticed. Maybe it can't quite handle a multi-stream on Crowdcast right now.
You want to talk about the NBN, do you?
Yeah, well, this is crazy, right? I mean, this happened before, but that's all right.
Well, that's a whole other podcast, the internet connection in Australia.
Right, that's a big scandal over here, isn't it? Mm-hmm. So why is it? I mean, generally speaking, the population seems to be very annoyed at the internet provision in the country. Is the annoyance justified, or are you just like it is? Mm-hmm. Like, what is the problem and why?
Well, the government that came in 6 years ago decided to make a patchwork quilt of what had previously been proposed and change the direction of what the NBN was. And as a result, they've spent more money, and it seems that they've not just delivered poor service, but they've promoted the NBN as being better and faster than what it actually is. And the times that most people experience with respect to the broadband download times that are rarely actually delivered to a vast majority of the customers. So it's all the bullshit that's gone on, I think, that's really annoyed the Australian population.
And it even goes back a bit further than that 6 years, than the patchwork job with the previous government before that, when they promised something, couldn't deliver it, over cost, and then it's like, well, what are we going to do? And then the next thing, someone's patchworking stuff together to try and fix it. And nothing has worked. So I think they're both at fault, to be honest with you.
Desperate stuff. You know what? Internet is so important these days. I do check the internet when I get into a hotel before I turn the water on. It's like the most important thing. And I'm thinking, wow, that's got to be a massive handicap. I mean, obviously, there's already geographical constraints in a country of this size. But you look at on a global level, which are the countries that are really understanding the need for fast internet. Your Singapore's, your Korea's, even China, for instance, with the government authorization of 5G and stuff like that. They know it's going to make have a transformational impact on their economy and society, and they're going for it. And it's a shame that some countries either don't have that vision or have allowed themselves to be captured by a vested interest in some way, and are putting the throttle on. Okay, as evidence of this, Adam has actually been lost to us, so I'll say goodbye on his behalf. Thank you, Adam, for your contribution. We have to close the show now. We're running a bit over, but let me thank everyone for joining. Omer and Molad, to begin with, thank you so much and for being so gracious and stepping down from your seat. Ross, Clennett, thank you for joining the show, and also Lauren Sharp. You've both been amazing.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, and thanks everyone for watching. I hope you've enjoyed the show. We're going to put this out on a podcast as well. Hi to everyone and bye to everyone on the Facebook group also. We'll be back, I think, next week. I might actually be in Kiev next week, in which case, you can never do any kind of Aussie media without promoting the one and only Greg Savage. The man does not need more promotion, though. He's the most he's the most famous Aussie recruiter on the planet, I think.
Well, I'm pleased to say, Hong, that that book was confirmed as the #1 selling business book or biography in the past week in Australian bookshops. So hooray for Australian TA and recruitment that one of our own is leading the charge in selling books. So get out there and buy it if you haven't already got a copy.
Indeed, and shout out to Greg as well. He's been a great supporter of Recruiting Brainfood as well. And I was actually trying to get him on the show in Sydney, but he wasn't able to do it due to travel commitments. But hopefully, I can get hold of him at some point. Okay, that's it, everyone. Thanks for your time. We'll be back next week.
Thanks, Hong. Bye.